PowerPoint thing. And this is a very short history of what I consider to be comics. Um, there's obviously a lot more we could get into, like I could make this 5 or 10 times as long, but um, I often point to things like this when we're talking about really early quote unquote comics, in the sense that these people are using pictures in sequence to tell a story. In this case, there aren't any words that go with this, but some comics don't have words. So this is very, very early, and it's just a Roman um, general, emperor, Roman leader who had these wars, and it's a carving that depicts what happened in all these battles and all the negotiations and the stuff. So it's in a spiral all the way up a column. So if you like were able to sort of walk around the column the whole way up, you'd be able to read the whole story, which I think is very interesting. Um, there are even earlier examples of this stuff, like Egyptian hieroglyphs and so on. But I just really like how clearly this is like a precursor to comics. Here's another early comic example. It's something called the Bayeux Tapestry. This is a similar thing where they're telling the history of battles. But in this case, it's not in stone, it's embroidered on fabric, which is, it's like crazy long. If you ever go to see this, I think you can see it in France somewhere. It takes up like all the walls of a room. It's very, very long. And this one does have words, albeit in Latin that I can't read. But for example, there it says Edward Rex. Rex means king, so it's King Edward. And again, it tells the pictures are in a sequence to tell the story. And then this became a meme a couple years ago. So we've got Lucas, I am thy father, nay. So you can actually go make your own Bayeux Tapestry memes if you want. So then we have slightly less early comics. So a way of creating images multiple times and then sharing them was etchings or woodblock prints, or what it's called intaglio here, where you put a metal plate in some acid and it eats away and then the ink gets into the grooves. And anyway, so that was a way for more than one person to have the image, because before this sort of thing was invented, if you made a drawing, you couldn't make copies of it unless you hand copied it. So the Japanese especially got very, very good at woodblock prints. So each color would have a different printing block. This is a very, very famous, I think it's called the Great Wave off of Kanazawa. Don't quote me on that. I might have gotten the place wrong, but it's like one of the most famous woodblock prints. And the political cartoons were part of that, like you would make copies and send them out to people. So this is a political cartoon making fun of Marie Antoinette and her like fashions at the time. And then next to it is a Gary Larson comic from The Far Side, also making fun of Marie Antoinette. Historical side note, she never said that thing about the cake. That was a rumor even before she became a queen. Like it was said about other queens and princesses. She was actually pretty generous and gave a lot of money to charities. That's not to say she wasn't like frivolous and spent a lot of money on ridiculous stuff, but she never said the thing about the cake.
Yes.
Side note. Okay, so then finally we get to what we actually think of as comics. In the early to mid 1800s, newspapers were becoming a thing, and then finally comic strips in newspapers became a thing. And this is also where we see the first use of speech bubbles, because before that they would either just put a caption below the comic or maybe inside, but there wouldn't be that little bubble. And so by the end of the 1800s, we get weekly comics with reoccurring characters, kind of like Archie comics, you know, but older, obviously. And in the early 1900s, you get Winsor McCay's Dream of the Rarebit Fiend and Little Nemo in Slumberland, which is like, there was actually a movie later on made called Little Nemo in Slumberland, but it's a very famous, very beautifully drawn early comic. So here's an example of that. This is supposed to be like a dream that this guy is having. that he's like really tall and he can bend over buildings and rip subways out of the ground and stuff. Later on, we got more comics available, and this sort of goes along with the history of printing. As printing got cheaper, it became more profitable to print not just very, very important stuff like history books and science books and the Bible and so on, but also just stuff that's for fun. So you get things like comics then when it becomes cheap enough to print them. And you get like action adventure comics. In 1938, Superman was invented. Ruby, I don't know where you are in your history classes, but do you know what was happening right around 1938?
No.
Okay. Do you know approximately when World War I and World War II were? I'll give you a hint. It was right before and right after 1938. So World War I had just happened, maybe like 10, 20 years ago. And World War II started in like, my history on this is not great either, but it was happening right around then. So Superman was created by two Jewish comics creators in 1938. And it was sort of a thing because that was when Hitler was coming to prominence and there was unrest in Europe. And Superman, when you think of him, he's like the all-American superhero, right? So it's interesting to think about how comics reflect the times. Anyway, so that's where Superman came from. Quick trip to the other side of the world. In Japan, manga was also becoming popular for similar reasons. Publishing was getting cheaper and it was becoming much easier to like publish a lot all at once. So manga, the ga in manga means picture. So manga refers to like paper comics. Anime is short for animation, which refers to TV shows. So that's just a terminology thing. Have you ever heard of the comic Astro Boy?
I have.
Right. So that was Osamu Tezuka's like I would say most famous comic that he created. He created a ton. He's kind of like the father of Japanese manga. He sort of didn't really create the genre, but he set a lot of like standards for what manga is today. So in the 1950s, you get something called the Comics Code Authority, which was kind of like a censorship board for comics. Do you know what I mean when I say censorship board?
No.
So it's people who would look at the comics before they got to be published and be like, you're not allowed to say that. You're not allowed to show it this way. You have to redraw this. And basically it was a code, like the rules for how you were allowed to draw and depict certain things, which is where we get things like, in old Batman cartoons where instead of actually showing him punching someone, they say bam or biff, like that's because they weren't allowed to show violence in a certain way in these comics and then later in the cartoons. There were other things they weren't allowed to show. Women had to be drawn a certain way. They couldn't show like, I don't know, like drugs or divorce or just anything that was like not cool for like 1950s America. So that's why when you read a lot of really old comics from this time period, they seem pretty goofy and really like unrealistic because they were published under this code authority who didn't let them show anything like real. It's very interesting to like think about because in the 60s and 70s, you get what's called the underground comics with an X artists. And they're like, you know what? We want to draw stuff like, I don't know, drugs or actual violence. And they started drawing and publishing without the Comics Code Authority approval. So, quick rewind. If you ever see an old comic and it has this stamp approved by the Comics Code Authority, that's what that means. That a bunch of people looked at the comic and said, yeah, this is kosher to print. You're allowed to print this. Up in the top left, we have Tintin, which is just an adventure comic from the early, like the 20s, 30s. Astro Boy and Superman, of course. And you can see you could buy the comic books for 10 cents. So this is an example of the comics with an X movement. And you can see it says adults only. And that's because these artists were like, we're tired of these very childish stories of unrealistic things happening. So we're going to draw like stuff for grown-ups, basically, which is interesting because I don't know. I think there's still sort of this feeling that comics are kind of for kids. Maybe not so much anymore, but it was definitely a thing back then. And they were trying to show that comics could be an art form to tell all kinds of stories, not just the really like Batman catches the Riddler again type stuff. And up in the corner, in the top right corner, it says approved by, it's supposed to be a joke about the approved by the Comics Code Authority. Okay, so then we get to the modern day comics, and oh my gosh, there are so many, so many. So you've got Marvel and DC, obviously. You've also got Dark Horse, which is kind of like the third one. There are tons of smaller publishers too that like don't even really get talked about, but they are out there churning out all these comics. And Koyama Press, First Second, I think is the name of the other one that I like a lot. Like there's a ton. The rise and popularity of manga in the Western world means that a lot of artists, it got dark again, are out there now who maybe watched Pokemon growing up, for example, and are sort of influenced by that in their art style. A good example of this would be like the people who created Avatar: The Last Airbender, if you've ever seen that, or like Steven Universe. There are elements of Japanese manga and anime styles in stuff created by Western comic and comic artists and animators now. In the 1990s and early 2000s, there was a rise in what we call indie comics, which basically means comics that aren't published by Marvel, DC, or Dark Horse. And a lot of those were autobiographical in nature. So instead of talking about superheroes, they were talking about normal people, your own experiences. And then, of course, we have things like comic book movies, making comics even more popular. So we've got, Marvel and DC, but then there are also smaller ones like Hellboy. Star Wars, which was a really big movie series, got made into comic books. So that's like a reverse of what usually happens. I literally just last night saw an ad on Instagram for DC's Swamp Thing, which I'd never heard of as a comic, but I guess it's a comic series about a guy who's like a swamp monster. Here's some examples of manga. So starting on the left, this is the most traditional manga style where it's just 4 panels to tell like a joke. This is from a series called Azumanga Daioh. The middle one is what we call shonen manga, which is quote unquote for boys, where it's more focused on like action adventure, not so much on like drama and emotions, which the one that's all the way to the right is focused on, which is a shoujo manga, which is quote unquote for girls, which is a little more like a drama or a romance or something like that. That one's Fruits Basket, I think. And then the one in the middle is Yu-Gi-Oh, obviously.
Yes.
Here's some examples of autobiographical comics that are really famous. So the one on the left is from Persepolis, and it tells the story of the author growing up in Iran in the 70s and 80s during the revolution there. And this is her getting told off by some scary religious ladies for wearing a denim jacket because it's like not appropriate. And then upper right is probably like one of the most famous autobiographical and also biographical comics called Mouse. And it's about the author's father's experiences as a Jew during World War II in the concentration camps and also before and after the war. And then the bottom right comic is from a comic called Fart Party by Julia Wirtz, and she tells really relatable stories about her everyday life. Some of them are more serious, like, for example, she has lupus, which is a disease that can be quite debilitating. But this particular panel is like the kid she's babysitting is asking her, "Are you what it's like to be a grown-up?" And she says, "I represent a very small portion of that demographic." And she has licorice sticks in her nose. Oh, right. And here we have like Thor, uh, Jessica, what's her name? Jones? Jessica Jones? I forget. Spooderman. I mean Spider-Man. I really love this movie because if you ever watch Spider-Man Into the Multiverse, it incorporates comic like stuff in it, like sound effects that are actually on the screen, which I thought was very clever for an animated movie. So that's my rather short history of comics. How do I stop sharing?